Hello and welcome to the Trial Files. I'm your host, Christine Worth. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that during the holidays, I take a break from publishing episodes so that I can spend time with my family, travel to where I need to go, and get ready for the new year. So you'll see some trial episodes, but there'll be fewer published each week until the end of the year. I just wanted to give you a heads up in case you were wondering what was happening. All right? So with that said, let's continue. Last time we sat through what was basically a DNA class, right? A full walkthrough of how the Wisconsin State Crime Lab says it handles evidence, protocols, workflow, contamination safeguards, or at least the versions of those things that Sherry Culhane was describing. And did you notice how she often softened her answers? We try to, we attempt to, we generally. You weren't imagining it. That was the theme of episode 43. A whole lot of this is what we mean to do, and not a lot of this is what we did. Today, though, hopefully, we shift from procedures to actual results. This is where Culhane explains what she found on the key in the RAV4 and in the testing that became the backbone of the state's case. So let's get back into it because the technical part is over. Hopefully, as you know, I never read ahead on these things. And I hope that we're getting into the DNA portion that talks about the case. And if you remember, we left off last time, they had all taken their lunch break. And so now they're all back. And Attorney Gunn continues his questioning of Sherry Culhane. Ms. Culhane, would you describe for the jury what procedures your crime lab has in place for the documentation and processing of evidence that is brought to your lab for analysis? When evidence is brought into the lab for analysis, whether it's through the mail or directly from an officer, we have individuals known as evidence specialists who take that evidence into the lab. They check to make sure it's packaged properly, that it's sealed properly, and then they give an item designation and a case designation to each piece of evidence. We have a computerized tracking system in the laboratory that works on a barcode system, and a barcode is printed that identifies that piece of evidence as belonging to a specific case with a number, and it also gives it an item designation. That was a long answer. When you perform testing on items or evidence that is brought to you by the law enforcement agency, do you create some type of case file? Yes, we do. And do you have that file with you today? Yes. Do you need it with you to testify today in this matter? Yes, I do. And does that file indicate whether you received evidence in the case of State of Wisconsin versus Stephen Avery? Yes. And does your file indicate what items and how many items of evidence were brought to the state crime lab for testing? Yes, it does. Can you tell the jury approximately how many submissions of evidence came to the crime lab as a whole, not just specific to the DNA unit, but to the whole crime lab for examination and analysis? I believe there was around 345. And what other units are there at the crime lab besides DNA that would be examining this type of evidence? We have a full service lab in the Madison lab, and we have a section that does fingerprints for identification. We have an imaging unit that takes photographs. We have a firearms section. We have a trace section. We have a drug analysis section and a document section. And specifically for the DNA unit, how many items, how many submissions were sent to you in this case at the DNA unit? 180. Is that normal for a case? No, that's very large. For you yourself, is this the largest number of submissions you have ever encountered in a case? Yes, it is. And how about for the crime lab as a whole? Were the submissions of 345 or 46 items the largest number of submissions the crime lab has received for one case? I believe so. Now, did you perform DNA testing on all 180 of those submissions to you? No, I did not. Tell the jurors what you do when an item of evidence is submitted to you. What's the first thing you do? The first thing we do is a visual examination of the item. We're looking, as I stated earlier, for a biological material, and a lot depends on what type of case it is. So we basically make a visual examination of the item. We take notes and we document the packaging of the item, what the item looked like, and exactly what we did. Depending on what biological material we're looking for, we have what's referred to as a presumptive test or preliminary test. And these tests give us a good indication of what kind of biological fluid that we're looking for. We perform these preliminary or presumptive tests on the evidence or on the stain. And from that point, we make decisions as to which direction we should go, whether we should continue with the analysis to take it to the final step, which is DNA, or do we stop? If we do a visual exam and there is no indication of a biological material, and it's not an item that was submitted specifically to be examined for touch, DNA that's left by touching, then that's the end of our analysis. If the presumptive test that we do for whatever biological fluid we're looking for is negative, then that's also the end of our analysis. Did you conduct presumptive tests on any of these 180 submissions to you? Yes, I did. Basically, Ms. Culhane, what were you looking for in this case? The bulk of the evidence in this case, I was looking for bloodstains. Do you know how many submissions of this evidence that you submitted to presumptive tests for blood? Yes. Tell me. 41. And did you get positives in those presumptive tests? Yes, they were all positives. How do you decide what to test and how to test it? A lot depends on the piece of evidence it is, the results of our presumptive testing, and also we have information as to what the alleged incidents are. Police officers and law enforcement that submit items of evidence will request certain testing based on whether they believe the item we're looking for is probative, whether it's going to provide information or not. So that plays into the decision that we make as to what type of analysis and how far to go. So you rely upon the investigators in the field and what they are finding. Is that correct? Correct. And they will make recommendations to you on the probative value of a particular piece of evidence? Yes. Do they ever ask you to prioritize an item of evidence and put it at the top of the list for testing? Yes. And why does that happen? A lot of times we're not really sure. That's information that they have. They may want results on a particular item of evidence sooner than the additional items of evidence. Usually it's prioritized based on what is the most probative and what is most important to their investigation. Now, you have spoken a number of times about standards and about reference samples. And once again, so the jury is clear, what is a standard? A standard is a known sample from a specific individual. And in most cases, we request buccal swabs, which is the swabbing of the inside of the cheek, because that's a rich source of DNA. So the inside of someone's cheek is swabbed, and that sample is used as a reference for their DNA types. Now, these are called also reference samples? Yes. Are they sometimes called exemplars? Yes. Did you receive standards in this case for testing? Yes, I did. Attorney Gahn then says, I'm going to ask Detective Wiegert if he would bring up to you standards that were received, and I'm going to ask you to identify them for the jury. Detective Wiegert then says, which number? Attorney Gahn says, Exhibits 317 through 325, please. And then he continues. Ms. Culhane, I'm going to ask you to look at those exhibits and tell the jury what the exhibit number is, and if you can, identify from whom the standard is from. The first one is exhibit number 319, laboratory item designation KL. It's a buccal swabs from Barb Janda, and I received this in the laboratory. I have markings, my initials, and dates that I received this. Thank you. Exhibit number 320, item designation, lab item designation KM. buccal swabs from Bobby Dassey. And again, these have markings, my initials, and the date. My markings are on this packaging. Exhibit 321, crime lab number or item designation KN, buccal swabs from Earl Avery. And again, my markings are on here with my initials. Exhibit 322, crime lab item designation KO. These are buccal swabs from Charles Avery. And again, my markings and initials are on this is the barcode that we put on it when it comes into the laboratory with the case number and the item designation. Attorney Buting then says, the record should reflect the witness was pointing to, it's a yellow label, is it not? The witness says yes. Attorney Buting says barcode. The witness says yes. And then she continues. Exhibit 323, crime lab item designation KP, and these are buccal swabs from Dolores Avery. Exhibit number 324, item designation BU, and these are buccal swabs from Stephen Avery. And again, my initials and markings are on the packaging. Exhibit number 251, crime lab item designation EM, and again, my initials and markings are on the packaging. Attorney Gahn then says, and Detective Wiekert, if you could find exhibits 317 and 318, these would be the buccal swabs of Alan and Brian Dassey. I'm sorry, Alan Avery and Brian Dassey. The court says, I'm sorry, did we hear what 251 was? Attorney Buting, again with the defense, says she didn't finish identifying 251. You just said the designation EM. And the witness says, oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. These are buccal swabs from Brendan Dassey. Detective Wiekert then says, this is 318. You want 317 as well? Attorney Gahn says, correct. And then continues to question the witness. Would you identify what's been handed to you as Exhibit 318? These are buccal swabs, item designation BS from Brian Dassey. Attorney Gahn then says, we're also looking, Detective Wiekert, for Exhibit 325. And then he continues. While he is looking for that, Ms. Culhane, you state that they contain what's called a item designation number. What is that number? That's a number that we assign to an item when it comes into the laboratory. We start with a case with item designation A, and then we go through the alphabet. And so that is the item designation that we assign the item. And would you please identify that exhibit? This is Exhibit 317, Crime Lab Item Designation AY, and these are buccal swabs from Alan Avery. And again, my markings and initials are on the packaging. This is marked as Exhibit 325, item designation from the crime lab as EF. And this is a slide holder that contains pap smear from Teresa Hallbach. And again, my initials are on the packaging. Attorney Gahn then says, and Your Honor, I might add that I believe there is a stipulation as to the pap smear for Teresa Hallbach. That was taken at the Bellin Hospital in Green Bay, Wisconsin in the year 2002. The court then says, is that correct, Mr. Buting? Attorney Buting says that is correct. The court says, very well, the court will accept that stipulation. Now, Ms. Culhane, did you develop DNA profiles from each of these standards that you just identified? Yes, I did. And did you compare the DNA profiles from these standards with the DNA profiles that you developed from evidentiary samples in this case? Yes. Now, did you issue reports in this case? Yes, I did. How many reports did you issue? 5. Attorney Gahn then says, I would ask Detective Wiekert to bring you exhibits 311 through 315. This is, yeah. Whew. Okay. I would ask you to identify each of those exhibits and tell the jury what they contain. Exhibit 311 is a copy of the first report that I wrote in the crime lab and the findings as of that point in time. Exhibit 312, I'm sorry, did you give the date of that? I'm sorry, no, that was issued on November 14th, 2005. The second report is listed as Exhibit 312. That was issued on December 5th, 2005, and that was additional testing and my results of that testing. Third report is marked as Exhibit 313. It was issued on March 31st, 2006. And again, it contains the findings in this group of analyses. The fourth report is marked as Exhibit 314. It was issued May 8th of 2006, and this is a copy of my report. The final report is marked as Exhibit 315, and it was issued December 4th, 2006. Let me just pause here for a second. Can you imagine? So you're in the jury, right? You're sitting in the jury box. Can you imagine trying to keep track of all of this? I mean, you probably don't have to because you'll have the information when you go to deliberate, right? But honestly, this is just, I mean, I'm sure it's got to be there for the record, but boy, this is just mind numbing information, right? It's like, yeah. Anyway, let's continue. Now, do each of those reports have your findings and conclusions that you came to after completing your DNA testing? Yes, they do. And do those reports describe the comparisons that you made between the DNA profiles developed from the standards compared to the DNA profiles developed from the crime scene samples? Yes, they do. I'm going to show you what has been marked as Exhibit 289, and previously identified as the 1999 Toyota RAV4 of Teresa Halbach. Do you recognize that? Yes, I do. When was the first time you saw that vehicle? On November 7th of 2005. And when I first saw the vehicle, it was in the garage bay at the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory. And what action did you take at that time? I was assigned to this case to process the car for biological materials. How do you go about processing the vehicle and tell the jurors, like, what you do first and then next in your process? The first step, processing a vehicle or any item of evidence, is, like I said before, is to do a visual examination. When I saw the vehicle, it had already been photographed. The doors were open. I looked inside the car, and it was obvious that there were numerous reddish-brown stains that were consistent with the appearance of blood. I began to go through and sample each one of these areas of staining and take notes and document where the stains were and what my preliminary tests indicated. I performed preliminary tests of all the stains that were the appearance of blood stains, reddish-brown stains. And again, I sub-designated each one of these stains. And the item designation of the vehicle was item A. And as I recovered stains from that, I numbered them A1, A2, until I recovered the number of stains. Attorney Gunn then says, I'm also going to ask that Detective Wiegert bring you what has been marked as Exhibit 326. I'm also going to ask Detective Wiegert if he would open that envelope and remove the contents and hand that to Miss Culhane or show it to her. And she answers, it's marked as Exhibit 326. This is the first thing that I recovered from the vehicle, and it's my item designation A-1. And how can you tell that? This is the coin envelope that I placed the swabbing of the stain into, and my markings, my initials and date is on it. And that envelope contains the actual swab that you took? Yes. And you state that you gave that crime lab item designation number A1. Is that correct? Yes. Attorney Gunn then says, and I'm going to ask Mr. Fallon, and this is another one of the prosecuting attorneys, if he would bring you what has been marked as Exhibit 296 and ask if you recognize that photograph. Yes, I do. And what is it? This is a large reddish-brown stain in the rear cargo area of the vehicle. And this is where I sampled for presumptive test, which was positive for blood. And then I sampled additional staining to continue with DNA typing. Do you have the laser pointer up there? Yes, I do. Just point to the area of where you did your presumptive test for blood. The presumptive test, and then very close to that, I sampled my actual sample that I tested for DNA. And would you describe for the jurors exactly how you did the presumptive test? Presumptive test is a color test, and it basically reacts positively with blood. I took a cotton swab, moistened it with sterile water. I swabbed just a tiny bit of the stain and I put regions on it. If it's blood, it turns bright red or pink, bright pink. And a negative reaction is no color change. So that I performed on this stain. Because it was positive, it gave me a good indication that this was probably a blood stain. So from that point, I sampled the stain that I was actually going to do my typing from. And tell the jurors how you sampled that. I took another clean cotton swab, put sterile water on it, and basically just removed some of the stain onto the cotton swab and then allowed it to air dry. And then what did you do with that cotton swab? I put it in. In the space where I was working, I have a test tube rack and I had a test tube and I put the swab in there and allowed it to air dry. Attorney Gahn then says, I would ask Detective Wiegert if you would remove the standards from the desk in front of Miss Culhane, and also you can bring back item A1 exhibit. And then he continues, and could you also describe for the jurors as how this stain appeared to you and the general size of the stain? Can you do that? It was a reddish brown stain, probably about that big. And you are, may the record reflect, 6 inches. You're holding your hand about 6 inches apart. Was this a large stain that you sampled? Comparatively speaking, most of the other reddish brown stains were much smaller than that. Attorney Gahn then says, now I would ask Detective Wiegert to bring you what has been marked as Exhibit 327. Your Honor, I had a talk with defense counsel, Mr. Buting, before we resumed this afternoon, and I have opened up the first exhibit, which was Exhibit 326, and Miss Culhane identified the coin envelope that had her swab in it. We have a number of swabs for her to identify, and Mr. Buting is not going to require us to open every envelope, oh thank God, and pull it out and identify it with her initials. If something comes up, they are here, we can open them. But I believe that's the understanding that we have. Attorney Buting says that is correct, Your Honor. And the court says, very well. And then Attorney Gahn continues. Miss Culhane, you have in front of you what has been marked as Exhibit 327. And does that envelope contain, can you tell what item designation number is contained in that envelope? Yes, item A2. A2. And can you tell the jurors where it was that you collected the swab in A2 from? It was collected from the plastic panel across the back cargo area of the vehicle. Like when you were stepping up into the cargo area, there is a plastic strip there, and A2 was collected from that plastic strip. Attorney Gahn then says, Mr. Fallon is going to show you an exhibit which has been marked as Exhibit 298. I would like you to examine that and also tell the jurors whether that photograph is depicted on the large screen as well. Yes, this is a photograph of the swabbing I took, A2, and it was actually located in this area here. Attorney Gahn then says, I would ask if Detective Wiegert would bring to you what has been marked as Exhibit 328. I will ask you, Ms. Culhane, if you can identify Exhibit 328? Yes, the item designation is A4. And what is A4? That's a swabbing that was recovered from this area here, this metal around the frame of the opening of the cargo door area. And prior to swabbing those areas, did you also do presumptive tests? Yes, I did. And what were the results of your presumptive tests on those two stains? Both A2 and A4 were positive. For what? For blood. Attorney Gahn then says, I'm going to ask Detective Wiegert if he would bring you Exhibit 329. Could you identify that exhibit, please? This is item designation A3. What is that? This is a cotton swab from a reddish-brown stain that was taken from the inside surface of the rear cargo door. Attorney Gahn then says Mr. Fallon is going to bring you a photograph marked as Exhibit 209. And I will ask if you recognize that and tell the jurors whether that photograph is depicted on the large screen. Yes, I do. This is the photograph I'm holding here, A3, was recovered from this area here. And did you also perform a presumptive test on A3? Yes, I did. And what were the results of that test? It was positive for blood. And similar to item designation number A1, did you take additional swabbings from A2, A4, and A3? Yes, I did. And what did you do with those? Those were taken in exactly the same manner that I took A1. I took a cotton swab and moistened it with sterile water, and I swabbed a portion of the stain and put it in a rack so it could dry, air dry. And what was the purpose of taking the swabs? Were you going to be conducting any further testing? Yes, my intention was to attempt to develop a DNA profile from those samples. Attorney Gahn says, I'm going to ask Detective Wiegert if he would bring you Exhibit 330. Jesus. Oh, I'm sure it's necessary, but jeez. I'm also going to ask Detective Wiegert if you will open that bag. Ms. Culhane, I'm going to ask you to handle this item. Would you like some gloves for that? Yes, please. Attorney Gahn says, I'm sorry, Detective Wiegert. Detective Wiegert says, that's all right. And then he continues, so I don't know what happened there. Can you identify that item? This is item designation A14, and this was a Pepsi can that was recovered from the cup holder by the front driver's side of the RAV4. Attorney Gahn then says, I'm going to ask Mr. Fallon if he would bring you a photograph that has been marked as Exhibit 293. And I'm going to ask you to tell the jury whether that photograph is depicted on the large screen. Yes, it is. And can you use the laser pointer and show the jurors where you found that Pepsi can? Right here. And you yourself found this Pepsi can there, correct? That's correct. And what did you do to process that can? Will you explain that and show the jurors? I collected this can with the intention of developing a profile to see if I could determine who may have drank out of the can. There is no visible staining on the can, so what I did was I took a cotton swab, a sterile cotton swab, just like I did in all the other stains, except in this particular case, I was only swabbing a particular area, not necessarily a stain. And I swabbed around the opening here where your mouth would touch if you drank out of this can. And just for the record, that exhibit is more properly described as a wild cherry Pepsi can. Yes, sir. And you didn't do any presumptive tests on that? No, I didn't. And why not? There were no visual indications that there were bloodstains of any kind. And what did you do with the swabs that you took from the wild cherry Pepsi can? I also put them in a rack and allowed them to air dry, and eventually developed a DNA profile from that. Attorney Gahn then says, I would ask Detective Wiegert if you could remove those items from that area. Detective Wiegert, I would ask if you would please take to Ms. Culhane Exhibit 331 and Exhibit 332. And I'm also going to ask Mr. Fallon if he will bring you a photograph which has been marked as Exhibit 292. Firstly, can you tell us what Exhibit 331 is? Yes, it's my item designation A9. And what is A9? It's a cutting that was taken from this area of the front passenger seat of a reddish brown stain. And did you tell us what Exhibit 332 is? 332 is my item designation A10, and that was a reddish brown stain that I recovered here from a CD case in the front passenger seat. Now, you stated that A9 was a cutting. How does a cutting differ from a swab? Anytime we have biological material on a hard surface, like glass or wood or that can, the best way to recover the most amount of DNA is to swab it with a cotton swab. If we have a stain that appears to be reddish brown stain, like blood or biological material that's on fabric, we simply cut that stain completely out. And what did you do with the cutting and the swab? I'm sorry, back up. Referring now to item A10, which is Exhibit 332. What is that? That was the swab from the CD case right here. And describe for the jurors what you observed on that CD case. There was a reddish brown stain on the case. I performed a presumptive positive or a presumptive test and got positive results. and therefore I sampled a portion of that stain to be further tested for DNA. Attorney Gunn then says, I would ask that Detective Wiegert would bring you exhibits 333 and 335. And can you identify what exhibit 333 is? Yes, this is my item designation A6. And can you identify 335? It's my item designation as A7. Attorney Gunn then says, and I'm going to ask Mr. Fallon to bring you a photograph that has been marked Exhibit 290 and ask you if this photograph is depicted on the large screen. Yes, it is. And would you tell the jurors what item A6 is, which is Exhibit 333? That's a cutting of a stain that was taken from this area. It's a stain on actually the fabric of the front driver's seat. And can you show the jurors what A7 is and where you obtained it? A7 were some reddish-brown crust that I found here on the floor beside the console. And did you perform any presumptive test on each of these samples? Yes, I did. And what test did you perform? I performed a preliminary test for blood. Both of them were positive. So therefore, I took the cutting of A6 from here, and I removed the blood crust of A7 from this area. And what did you do with those? The cutting I put in a coin envelope and sealed it up, and the blood crust I put into a tube, a small plastic tube, and sealed that and put that in a coin envelope. Attorney Gunn that says, I'm going to ask Detective Wiegert if he would bring you Exhibit 334, and I'm going to ask Mr. Fallon to bring you a photograph that has been marked as Exhibit 294. And I ask you if Exhibit 294 is the photograph that is depicted on the large screen. Yes, it is. And can you identify what Exhibit 334 is? It's my item designation A12, and that was this reddish-brown stain here that I sampled. It's on the metal door frame on the passenger side, between the back seat and the cargo area. And did you conduct any presumptive tests on that stain? Yes, I did. I tested preliminary test for blood, and it was positive. And then what did you do? I again sampled that in a clean cotton swab with sterile water, and I took another portion of the stain, I let it air dry, and that's what I used for my DNA analysis. Attorney Gunn says, I'm going to ask Detective Wiegert to bring you Exhibit 336, and I'm going to ask Mr. Fallon to bring you a photograph that has been marked as Exhibit 291. And I ask you if Exhibit 291 is the photograph that is depicted on the large screen. Yes, it is. And will you identify for the jurors what Exhibit 336 is? It's my item designation A8, and it was a sample that I recovered from this reddish-brown stain here, right by the ignition. Did you conduct a presumptive test for blood on that stain? Yes, I did, and it was positive. Then, after you conducted your presumptive test, what did you do? I sampled another portion of that stain on another cotton swab, and that's what I retained for my DNA testing. And after you collected all these stains, then what did you do with them? I processed the car down in the garage area of our laboratory. We have like a workspace, a workbench there, and that's where I had all my samples set up. When I was completed processing the car, those were taken to my workbench, and the cotton swabs were put into small coin envelopes to keep them until I began my analysis on them. And when you say begin your analysis, are you talking about the DNA testing procedures? Yes, I am. In other words, you are going to begin those 5 steps that you described to the jurors before lunch? Correct. Attorney Gunn says, I would ask if Detective Wiegert would bring you Exhibit 325. It's the pap smear of Teresa Halbach. Now, we have already identified that exhibit as the pap smear of Teresa Halbach. Is that correct? Yes. What is a pap smear? Oh, geez. Well, I suppose there's guys on the jury, they might not know. As I understand it, okay. As I understand it, it is a sample of cells from a woman's cervix. It is used for medical testing to check for abnormal cells. And where would the DNA come from in a pap smear? As I stated earlier, any nucleated cell is going to have DNA. So any of the cells from the pap smear cervical area tissue cells, it will come from the nucleus of those epithelial cells that are on that smear. Now, using the DNA technology that you described before lunchtime, did you develop a DNA profile for Teresa Halbach from that pap smear? Yes, I did. And I'm going to ask you if, according to your reports, does the slide we will put up next display your results? Yes, it does. I would like you to take the laser pointer and at this point explain to the jurors exactly what they are looking at. This series of numbers and letters on this side are referred to as genetic markers. And all of this information pinpoints where those genetic markers are found throughout your DNA. Earlier, I talked about the target regions of DNA that are amplified, and we make a whole lot of copies of them. This is what I was referring to. We looked at 15 different target areas of DNA that are amplified. These numbers on the right side are the types at each one of these locations. So, for instance, at D3S1358, Teresa Halbach's type is a 1618. Are there other possible types at that genetic location of D3S1358? Yes. Do you know how many different types there are at that location? Not exactly, but probably something like 11 to 20. Can you compare for the jurors when you talk about types, how these would be like ABO types? These types are actually the different fragment sizes, those different target sizes that we amplified. The ABO system is a type of genetic marker, but the discriminating power of ABO systems, which is what we used many years ago, is much less than the discriminating power of all of these combined types. Now, you previously testified that you collected your swab A1 from the rear cargo area. Yes, of the RAV4. Is that correct? Yes. Can we go to the next one, please? And again, please show the jurors where you collected your A1 from. In this area right here. And that was a blood stain that tested positive in this presumptive test, correct? Right. You also testified that you collected swab A2 from across the panel of the rear cargo area. Show for the jurors again where that was. Yes, that was right in this area here. And you also testified that you collected your swab A4 from the metal frame. Show the jurors where that was. Right along here. And you also testified that you collected A3 from the cargo door itself. Is that correct? Yes. And can you show the jurors where that is? Right here. And again, all of these stains, you had a presumptive positive test for blood. That's correct. And you also testified that you collected a swab from the wild cherry Pepsi can, which you labeled at A14. Is that correct? Yes, right here. And again, show the jurors. Thank you. Now, did you develop DNA profiles from each of these swabs? Yes, I did. And according to the reports that you have, does the following slide correctly depict your results? Yes, it does. And again, would you explain to the jurors what this slide shows? Again, these are the genetic markers. These are the 15 different markers we're looking at. And these are the types that were developed from each one of these evidence samples. And each one of those evidence samples came from the RAV4 of Teresa Halbach, correct? Correct. Now, can you tell whether this particular DNA profile is from a male or a female? Yes. How can you do that? This marker here, referred to as, pardon my pronunciation here, amylogen, is a gender marker. If you are female, you are only going to have an X chromosome. If you are a male, you will have a X and a Y chromosome. So this profile is from a female? Correct. I notice that after genetic marker D7SA20, there is an 11? Correct. Why is there only one number there? As I stated earlier, these genetic markers are independently inherited, just like genes. So you inherit 50% from your mom and 50% from your dad. Now, the fact that this is an 11 means that she is a homozygote at this marker. And that means she got the same type from her mom and the same type from her dad. At D3, there are two markers. This is referred to as a heterozygote, and she received one from her mom and one from her dad. And this DNA profile that you developed from the cuttings and the swabs from the RAV4, did you compare that profile to the DNA profile that you developed from Teresa Halbach's pap smear? Yes, I did. And according to your reports, does this slide correctly display your findings? Yes, sir, it does. Would you please point out to the jurors your findings and conclusions? Again, these are all the genetic markers, and you can see that the types from the evidence samples are consistent with the types from the pap smear of Teresa Halbach. So at this genetic marker, the evidence sample is 1618. Teresa is 1618. At this marker, it's 69.3. Teresa is a 69.3. And all of these markers are consistent with the ones from Teresa Halbach. And did you calculate a statistic to determine how rare or how common this particular DNA profile would be in the population? Yes, I did. And I'm going to show you a slide and ask if this correctly depicts the statistical analysis that you performed. Yes, it does. And would you explain to the jurors what this slide means? Remember earlier, I said that we do a statistical analysis when we have a match between an evidence sample and a reference sample. If we have an exclusion, we're finished. That's the end of it. But if you have a match between an evidence sample and a reference sample, then you have to determine how common or how rare that match, or that profile from the evidence sample is in the population. This first number here tells me that the probability of finding someone in the Caucasian population, some unrelated random person that has the same profile as the evidence sample, the probability of that is one person in 416 quadrillion in the Caucasian population, one person in 642 quadrillion in the African American population, one person in the 641 quadrillion in the Southeastern Hispanic population, and one person in 1 quintillion in the Southwestern Hispanic population. And why do you look at these different populations when you are estimating the frequency of these genetic markers? When we are calculating and estimating these frequencies, we use a database that's maintained by the FBI. And that database has samples from individuals in these 4 different population groups. This slide illustrates that even though the rarity of the profile is different, in these 4 population groups, there's not a lot of difference between population groups. There are some differences, but this profile is extremely rare across all 4 populations. What do these numbers mean, Ms. Culhane? This number means that the probability of finding a person, random person, unrelated in the population that has the same profile as the evidence sample is one person in 416 quadrillion. Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty whether Teresa Halbach is the source of the blood that you found on A1, A2, A3, and A4, and the source of the biological fluid on the wild cherry Pepsi can? Yes, I do. And what is that opinion? That Teresa Halbach is the source of the DNA from those items. Attorney Gahn says, I'm going to ask Detective Wiegert to bring you what has been marked as Exhibit 337. Again, I have spoken with defense counsel before we began this afternoon, and Ms. Culhane, does that container, which is Exhibit 337, contain some charred remains that you examined in this case? Yes, it does. And did you assign a crime lab designation number to that? Yes, I did. What is that? Item BZ. And I'm going to ask you to look on the slide on the big screen. And What is contained in that box there in front of you, which is Exhibit 337? Is this the piece of charred remains that you examined? Yes, it is. And when did you receive this? Do you know? I can refer to my notes, please. The court says, do we have a number for the photo exhibit? Attorney Gahn says, Your Honor, we don't have that with us. Really? But you will get one. And then she answers, item BZ was taken into the laboratory on November 11th, 2005. And was this, when you examined this, was this a combination of bone and tissue? It appeared to be, yes. And what is shown on the big screen here, which we will later get an exhibit for and mark it, is that the bone and tissue fragment sample that you examined? Yes, it is. How did you go about processing this for DNA? Because this sample was compromised, it had been appeared to be subjected to intense heat, I needed to find an area that I felt was the least damaged. So I chose a portion of the tissue, which I believe was in this area here, close to the bone, and sampled a portion of that to continue my extractions and to continue my typing. Were you able to develop a DNA profile from this piece of charred remains? Yes, I was. And according to your reports, does the next slide correctly display your findings of your test? Yes, it does. Would you explain to the jurors what this is? Again, these are the genetic markers that we're looking at, and these are the types. You will notice here there are no numbers at these positions, these markers. And the reason is because this was a fairly degraded sample of DNA. DNA is a very stable molecule. However, it breaks down and is degraded and broken up into pieces by several things, heat being one, sunlight, nucleuses in the environment that chew it up. But this was obviously a sample that had been subjected to intense heat. And so, therefore, on these fragments, these STR markers, which are fairly large, the fragments, there was not enough DNA at those positions to develop a type. Did you compare this partial profile with the DNA profile that you obtained from the pap smear of Teresa Halbach? Yes, I did. And does this slide accurately depict your findings? Yes. And would you please explain what your findings were to the jury? At the marker positions where I did get results, these types are consistent with Teresa. Obviously, I don't know what the types are here because there were no results. But for everything else, all the types that I actually developed, they were consistent with Teresa Halbach. Now, you stated previously when you made your comparisons to Teresa Halbach's DNA profile with the samples of blood that you found in the RAV4, you were able to determine that Teresa Halbach was the source of that blood. Is that correct? Yes. Can you say that in this case? No. Why not? This was a partial profile. When we have a partial profile, we can only do a statistical interpretation on the markers that we have results for. In order to get very large numbers and very rare profiles, what gives us those large numbers is results at all 15 different markers. When we have less than that, then the frequency of that profile becomes a little more common than it would if it were a complete profile. Were you able to develop a statistic to tell you how rare or how common the DNA profile on item BZ, the charred remains, would be in the population? Yes, I was. And does the next slide depict the frequency in the population of the DNA profile on the charred remains? Yes. And would you explain to the jury these numbers and what they mean? This calculation was done exactly like the calculation from the bloodstains. The difference is this was not a full profile, it was only a partial profile. So if you do get a statistical analysis of the types that you got and calculated the frequency of those types, the probability of another random unrelated person in the population having the profile, the partial profile of the remains, is 1 person in 1 billion in the Caucasian population, 1 person in 2 billion in the African American population, 1 person in 2 billion in the Southeastern Hispanic population, and 1 person in 3 billion in the Southwestern Hispanic population. And again, can you break this down for the jurors exactly what that number, 1 billion, would mean as it relates to this DNA profile from the charred remains? This is the frequency that that partial profile, those results at just the markers that I got results from, the frequency of that partial profile, that is the frequency that it occurs in the population. Are there a billion people in the state of Wisconsin? I don't believe so. Attorney Gahn then said, Your Honor, I have now what has been a photograph that has been marked as Exhibit 338. I will ask Mr. Fallon if he will give that to Ms. Culhane. And Ms. Culhane, would you look at that photograph, and is that a photograph of the piece of charred remains that we previously put up on the large screen? Yes, it is. Attorney Gahn then says, I would ask if Detective Wiegert would bring you Exhibit 237. I'm sorry, 277. This would be the bullet fragment. And can you identify that exhibit that's in front of you, Ms. Culhane? Yes, this is a crime lab item designation FL, and it is a lead bullet fragment. My initials and markings are on the packaging. And can you tell when you received that exhibit? That came into the laboratory on March 16th, 2006, and I took custody on March 28th, 2006. And how did you process that bullet? The first thing I did was, just like every item of evidence, it was a visual examination. There was nothing visual on the fragment. There didn't appear to be any stain. So in order to remove any residual DNA that might have been on the bullet, I washed it. I put it in a test tube and washed it with some buffer that we use to extract the DNA. And the washing of that bullet, the washing liquid, is what I performed the rest of my procedure on. And were you able to develop a DNA profile from that washing on item FL, the bullet? Yes. And according to your reports, does the next slide correctly display your findings? Yes, it does. And would you please explain your results to the jurors? Again, I was looking at all of these. These are the different markers, and these are the types at each one of those markers. You will notice at D16 and at TPOX, there's an asterisk there that indicates that there was a visible peak there, which represents a type. But it was below our parameters for including that in the final analysis. So I'm missing a peak here and a peak at TPOX. And did you compare this profile that you obtained from the bullet fragment with the DNA profile you obtained from the pap smear of Teresa Halbach? Yes, I did. And according to your reports, does this slide correctly display your findings? Yes, it does. And would you explain them to the jury? The profile from the bullet is consistent with all of the types from Teresa Halbach. You will notice at D16, she's missing the 13 type, and at TPOX, she is missing the 10 type. And again, those peaks were visible, but they were below our threshold for calling those types. Did that have any impact on your match criteria in this interpretation? The impact is that I cannot use the information, the frequencies at this marker and at this marker to figure out my final frequency. In other words, I had to calculate the frequencies at all of the other markers except D16 and TPOX. But nothing about those two asterisks that you have on the chart here excluded Teresa Halbach as being on the bullet. That's correct. Kind of sounds like they're reaching there a little bit, doesn't it? Anyway. Does this match differ in any way from the previous matches that you called? Yes, it did. And could you explain to the jury what happened? During the extraction of this item of evidence, as I talked about earlier, we set up controls that we run with all of our samples. When we begin an extraction, whether it is an evidence sample or a reference sample, we begin the extraction. We begin what's called a manipulation control. And it's basically a negative blank control. And it helps us monitor if any unintentional DNA is introduced into the sample or into the process. In this particular case, there was a trace amount of A trace amount of DNA showed up in the quantitation portion where I had to quantitate and find out how much DNA I had. There was a trace amount of DNA in the negative control. I took the profile to completion and I developed the profile on it. And the profile in the negative control turned out to be consistent with my own DNA type. What did that mean? That means that during the extraction procedure, I inadvertently introduced my own DNA into the negative control. Did that have any impact on your interpretation of your results? It did not have any impact as far as the profile from the evidence sample. It's just the fact that I introduced my own DNA into the manipulation control. Were there any other profiles developed on the bullet besides Teresa Halbach? No. I'm just going to pause here because this just popped into my head. So you're loading a gun, right? You touch the bullet to load into the gun, correct? Why wouldn't the person's DNA who loaded the bullet also be on the bullet? Maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe the defense will get into that. I have no idea. Anyway, let's continue. I believe it was Teresa Halbach's profile the only profile that you found on that bullet? Yes. Were there any mixtures? No. And your profile was found where? In the negative control, which should have had just regions in it. It should not have had any DNA at all in it. And how do you think your DNA profile got into that control? I believe my DNA profile was introduced during the extraction procedure when I was talking. At the time when I was setting up these samples, I was training two analysts, newer analysts in the lab, and they were watching me. This sample was not an average sample simply because we handled it a little different. It wasn't a swabbing and it wasn't a cutting. The washing part of it was a little bit different than what we usually do. So I was explaining to them what I was doing and as I was setting it up. And apparently I felt as if I was far enough away from my workbench not to introduce my DNA, but apparently I was incorrect. Is she not wearing a mask? Why are you not wearing a mask? Now, your DNA did not come up on the bullet, did it? No. It was only in the control? That's correct. Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty whether Teresa Halbach is the source of the DNA on item FL, the bullet? Yes. And what is that opinion? I believe she is the source of the DNA on that bullet. Attorney Gahn then says, I would ask if Detective Wiegert would please bring to Miss Culhane what's been marked as Exhibit 324, and this would be the buccal swab of Stephen Avery. Your Honor, before I go any further, I think we have some considerable more testimony for the rest of these samples. Would you like to break now? The court says, I was hoping he'd say yes, but he's not. I mean, not that I can't stop, but what's the point? Might as well just break where they do. The court says, I think we'll go another 15 minutes to kind of split the afternoon equally in two. Attorney Gahn says, okay. And then he continues. Detective Wiegert has brought you what has been marked as Exhibit 324. And that is what you identified as the buccal swab of Stephen Avery? Yes. And once again, that's what's called a standard, correct? Correct. And what are standards used for? As reference samples to compare to the evidence samples. Using the DNA testing procedures that you described this morning, did you develop a DNA profile from the buccal swab of Stephen Avery? Yes, I did. And does the next slide correctly depict the DNA profile that you developed from Stephen Avery's buccal swab? Yes, it does. And would you describe for the jurors your findings? These are the same genetic markers that I examined when I looked at the evidence samples and the standard from Teresa Halbach. And again, at each one of these markers, Stephen Avery's sample had a specific type. The amylogenin marker is XY, which is different from Teresa because this is a male individual, and he has the X and Y chromosome. We heard testimony yesterday that a number of swabs were taken from the garage floor of Stephen Avery. And did you receive at the crime lab swabs that were taken from the garage floor of Stephen Avery's garage? Yes, I did. And did you assign crime lab designation numbers G, I1, J, K, O, and P to 6 of the swabs from the stains on the garage floor of Stephen Avery's garage? Yes, I did. And did you test those swabs from Stephen Avery's garage floor? Yes, for a DNA profile. And did you obtain a DNA profile? Yes, I did. And does the next slide correctly show the DNA profile that you obtained from the 6 swabs of blood from the garage floor? Yes, it does. And again, you can see that the types are consistent throughout all of the markers that we looked at. Now, did you receive other items? We have had testimony in this case that bloodstains from the sink or the vanity in the residence of Stephen Avery were taken and sent to the crime lab. Do you recall that? Yes. And do you recall submitting those to DNA testing? Yes. And did you develop a profile from those submissions? Yes, I did. And what was the profile you developed? It was consistent with Stephen Avery's profile. And I'm going to show you the next slide. And this has been identified as the Grand Am, the 1993 Grand Am owned by Stephen Avery. Did you also examine this at your crime lab? Yes, I did. And on the next slide, can you point out to the jurors, did you locate any bloodstains in that vehicle? Yes, there were bloodstains on the gear shaft here and along the console. And did you do presumptive tests on those bloodstains? Yes, I did. And did you eventually do DNA testing on those bloodstains? Yes. And what were your results? The types were consistent with Stephen Avery. We had testimony a few days ago that there was a swab taken of the release lever of the hood latch of Teresa Hallbach's RAV4. That was identified as Exhibit 205. Attorney Gunn then says, will you find that exhibit, please, Detective Wiegert? Can you identify that exhibit, Ms. Culhane? Yes, this is our item designation ID, and it has our laboratory barcode item designation and my initial and date on it. And that contains a swab from the hood latch of Teresa Hallbach's RAV4? Yes. And did you perform DNA testing on that hood latch? Yes. Swab. Do you recall when you looked at the swab, did you notice any condition to it as far as color? It was discolored, but it did not have the appearance, it was not a reddish brown discoloration consistent with blood. So it did not appear to have blood on the swab? Correct. But you proceeded with DNA testing on the swab nevertheless? Yes. Huh, wonder why. And did you develop a profile from the swab of the hood latch of Teresa Hallbach's RAV4? Yes, I did. And I'm going to show you the next slide and ask you, do your notes and your records reflect these as your findings? Yes, they do. Could you explain what your findings were to the jury? Looking at these same genetic markers, these are the types that were developed from the swab that was reportedly taken from the hood latch of the RAV4. And this is what you would call a full profile. Is that correct? Yes. What does that mean when you say it is a full, complete profile? A full profile indicates that you have gotten results at all 15 different markers that we look at. If this was a partial profile, such as in the charred remains, I would be missing types at some of these markers. Did you compare this profile that you found on the swab of the hood latch of Teresa Hallbach's RAV4 with the DNA profile that you developed from the buccal swab of Stephen Avery? Yes, I did. And does this next slide correctly display your findings? Yes, it does. And would you please describe your findings to the jurors? At each one of the markers, the types from the swabbing on the hood latch were consistent with the types from Stephen Avery's buccal swab. If you look at all the numbers for all of the markers, they are consistent with the entire profile. Now, you testified before that you received a number of standards at the crime lab. Did you? Yes. In other words, you received buccal swabs from Alan Avery, Brian Dassey, Brendan Dassey, Barb Janda, Bobby Dassey, Earl Avery, Chuck Avery, and Dolores. Is that correct? Yes. The court says, Mr. Gahn, excuse me. After you wrap up this portion of the hood latch, I think we'll take our break. Attorney Gahn says, yes, Your Honor, fine, thank you. And then Attorney Gahn continues. Did you develop DNA profiles from all those standards of reference samples? Yes, I did. When you would come up with a profile from an evidentiary item like the hood latch, did you compare the profile from the hood latch with all the other standards? Yes, I did. And what were the results? They were inconsistent. The profile from the hood latch was not consistent with any of the other standards that I examined. But the profile from the hood latch matches Stephen Avery? That's correct. And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty whether the DNA profile that you developed from the swab of the hood latch of Teresa Halbach's RAV4, that Stephen Avery is the source of that profile? Yes. And what is that opinion? That he is the source of that profile. Attorney Gahn then says, thank you. And again, my mind's just going all over the place. So, you take your car in, right? You have it serviced or somebody else does it for you, whatever the case. Bottom line is that if you, from the time you own it, purchase it, somebody's in there. Somebody's opening up your hood. Somebody's looking, somebody's changing the oil. They're doing whatever. There's going to be lots of different DNA profiles in there. I mean, I sit there and think about my own vehicle, and take it to our mechanic to have the oil changed, to have all this other stuff done. And they've got to touch all those all the time. And it's not always the same person. Why was Stephen Avery so perfect? Why wasn't it a mixture of multiple DNA types? So anyway, at this point, the court says, all right, thank you. At this point, they're going to take their afternoon break. And we are going to end this episode and then pick back up in a third episode with Sherry Culhane. So let's take a breath. Yes, I know we're still deep in the weeds with Sherry Culhane. Today was less forensic files and more of catalog of every swab in Wisconsin. But beneath all that procedure, all that packaging tape, the state's core story is starting to come into focus. We've got blood in Teresa's car, 4 different spots, each tested and matched to her with statistical rarity that Culhane says is off the charts. We've got DNA from her pap smear matching the blood in the cargo area. And we've got a partial profile from charred remains that's likely hers. Though Culhane does stop short of calling it a definitive match. And then there's the wild cherry Pepsi can, the bullet fragment, the hood latch, each one linking back to either Teresa or Stephen. Now, if you remember, the bullet fragment had no visible stain, but it yielded Teresa's DNA. Very possible. Very possible. But in the meantime, we've got Culhane's own DNA showing up where it shouldn't, in the negative control, because apparently she was talking while she was doing these samples. No mask, no barrier, nothing. And then there's the hood latch. No blood, just a full profile for Stephen Avery. Not a mixture, not degraded, just pristine DNA from a latch inside a car that had already been processed and moved and touched. I'm not saying, contamination. I'm just saying, nothing about this lab's methods is inspiring a ton of confidence. I mean, yes, the credentials and all the stuff that they had to go through is impressive, and I'm sure that it's comparable to other DNA places. I don't know. But boy, I think the thing that really got me was when her own DNA had been introduced into something because she wasn't even wearing a mask. And she was teaching. It was a teaching moment. But so she can't wear a mask while she's talking? That doesn't make sense. I mean, they do all the time in surgery, right? In the next episode, we're going to stay with Culhane and we're going to continue until the defense has their shot and they are finally done. with her testimony. Until then, we'll talk soon. This is shortly before Thanksgiving, so if that's a holiday that you celebrate, happy Thanksgiving. We'll talk soon. Bye for now.